Good morning. It's time to start our classes. We're studying the post-exilic time period in our auditorium class, both on Sunday and Wednesday. Our Sunday classes are studying basically the historical narratives as Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther recorded there, and then Tom is leading us through those prophets of Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi that coincide with this same time period. We're studying a lot of what happened then, but hopefully we're also learning things from this that are practical for our own faith and for our own trust in God's promises. And I hope we'll keep emphasizing that. And I won't forget to mention those things where I think it's particularly pertinent, because that's really what we want to take away from this, is seeing how even when times seem dark and the people of Israel were in captivity, or a tiny small band of them returned to find their temple and their city in ruins, that God's plan was still in motion and still to be trusted, that He would fight for them and work for them, and ultimately we can see that fulfilled in the lineage that continued through these Jews to the coming Messiah. So we're going to be studying beginning in chapter 3 of Nehemiah, chapters 3 and 4. As announced last week, this is kind of a split lesson. It's lesson 5, the first half of lesson 5 in our book. It begins on page 25. Because there's just so much here, thought it was a good place to split it and divide it into two studies. So counting the second half of this, we'll have 3 more lessons in Nehemiah before we get into Esther. So I think it's a very rich section for us to study and get into. So glad to have those of you that are visiting with us. And hopefully, if you don't have a book, you'll be able to follow along in the scriptures, and I think they'll be just about as good, if not better than the book. But there's some supplemental material in there, and pictures and diagrams and things that I think are helpful. So you can follow along in that as we go together this morning too. So let's stop and have a word of prayer before we get started. Father in heaven, we're so thankful for your promises and for the trust we can have in you as our God and as the Creator and the one in control of all things. We're thankful for the lessons we can gather from your care of your people throughout history, and for the trust we can have that you will care for us. I pray that you'd help us to glean good things from our study this morning, and we pray, Father, that we might be encouraged and that we might be emboldened in our service, that we might also have a mind to work in your kingdom. And we pray, Father, that you'd be with those we know that need your special care at this time, those that are sick and suffering in other ways. Pray you'd strengthen them. Pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Just a very quick, just one, I'm not going to have any maps on this this set of slides, but just the timeline once again to show we're here near almost the time of Malachi coming on the scene. Some people say that actually was overlapping with Nehemiah, others that he came shortly thereafter, but this is going to take us through 3 more lessons in the time of Nehemiah, which we're saying is around 444, 445 BC when these events are taking place. And then after 2 or 3 more lessons, we'll come back and get the middle section of Esther that comes afterwards. But we said all these emphasize some type of restoration or preservation of either God's people, God's laws, or the temple, the natural place where God's name dwelled among them. But the main thing we want to emphasize throughout this is God's faithfulness to His promises, God in control of His plan. So just quick review what we studied last week. Remember the word came from Jerusalem in the first part of chapter 1, and basically they said the wall is broken down and the gates are burned with fire. All of God's people were in great trouble and shame, and Nehemiah was obviously very concerned, and he wept and mourned and fasted. Seems almost like for 4 months this went on, because the first part of chapter 2 gives us the new date is 4 months later. And at least either a summary or a particular prayer is recorded in verses 5 through 11, and talked about different parts of that. Basically, he showed his reverence to God before he goes and asking for help for God. But the prayer concludes, "Give success to your servant today, grant him mercy in the sight of this man." We saw this man was the king of Persia, the most powerful ruler of the most powerful empire to date at that time. And he was coming before them as his cupbearer and was allowed into the inner court because of that job that he had and connections that he had. And we made the point, again, this is great faith shown by Nehemiah, but also showed God's providence. And God should have the glory because he had this man at the right time, at the right place to do exactly what he did. And of course, Nehemiah should be credited for following God's plan and approaching the king as he did. So we see in the second chapter then he's sad before the king, and the king notices, and Nehemiah explains why he's sad, because he said the city where the tombs of my fathers are buried lies in ruins, and there's this terrible state for where my homeland lies. And then the king says, "Well, what do you want?" And Nehemiah made the point, I won't go into it in detail, but had prayed for months about what he wanted, and so he was ready to give in very close order several steps that he needed and requested. And he continued to pray for God's help, and that this man who was before, who would open his heart and give him favor before him. But he had been prepared for that, and he acknowledged that it was really the good hand of God that was upon him and upon the king that he was granted that. So he gets in with the cavalry arriving more or less with Persia, gets back to Jerusalem with all the letters and giving him authority to do this. And the enemies of the Jews were not very happy about that. Someone had come to seek the welfare of the people. And then the last summary slide from last week, we saw that once he got there, he did some inspecting, and then he did some instructing about his plan. And the people, because it's so very persuasive and showed that God had been with him to that point, said, "Let's rise up and build." Then there's a little bit of inquisition from the enemies and mockery, but Nehemiah comes back and says, "This is from God. This is the source of that. And we all have solidarity in that, and you can't take part in it because you're basically," he said, "you have no lot in the Jewish heritage, and we're not going to mix together with people who have blended heathen religions with our religion." So that's really gets us to where we're going to start today in chapter 3. Noticed, I think I had this slide up last week, the part that Nehemiah is going to be rebuilding is just that kind of in bold outline that looks like a comma. There's this big square kind of upper left, which would enclosed. If you go and look at the wall of the ancient city, if you went to visit Jerusalem, would be much larger because it includes parts of where at the extent of Solomon and other expansions went out to the northwest from that. But the very skinny part in that would be what would be called the City of David in the earliest part, and then the Temple Mount, where it was expanded and closed in the time of Solomon when the temple was built. So again, this is the time machine drone view of what the city would have looked like when much of the gates were torn down and so forth, if you looked at the part that now we concentrate on. So let's go to the gate and the wall sections in the builders. There's chapter 3 of Nehemiah. There's some 32 verses that list who the builders were, what the walls were, what the gates were, and what the sections were. I know I'm tempted if I'm going over this and I'm not studying it for a class, but maybe daily Bible reading. How much time would you spend on this chapter 3 if you were trying to cover several chapters that day? We'd be very tempted to just breeze over all these names and places and gates and sections of the wall. But I'm not going to do that today, so hopefully it won't bore you to death. And I put a lot of visuals in here. It's not all original with me, but someone's made these mock-ups of what the walls look like and different pictures. And so we'll try to give credit to the builders in the study today because God and through inspired chronicler of what happened in Nehemiah's time. Nehemiah himself lists who these builders were, and God saw fit to give them credit. We're going to spend some time going over that. So the way the Nehemiah 3 account gives it, it starts at the upper left there, which would be on the northwest corner of the wall that they were going to repair, and it goes counterclockwise around down the western side, around the southern side, and so I got a little animation to show. This is going to be the order of the repairs that are listed. I don't think this is means that I don't think we should infer that the repairs were done sequentially. I think they were done simultaneously, but this is just the way that that's recorded in Nehemiah's account. In fact, it's pretty clear at one point where it says all these gaps were closed to half of the normal height, that this was all happening together, and all these people were working at the same time, but he's going to record at least one by one. And really it's extremely important just if we have an interest in the actual topography of the city and of the layout and what the city actually looked like. This section in Nehemiah 3, and then later on there's some details in Nehemiah 12 where the wall is dedicated. There's really very little else in the Bible to describe what the city of Jerusalem looked like in that time. And there's if I have time at the end, there's been archaeological digs and so forth that have confirmed a lot of what Nehemiah's account says, but of course we put our trust in the biblical account, but it gives us a lot of details about what the city looked like, so it's very helpful just from understanding of the layout and the topography of the land. So here's the picture from the north side, and verses 1 and 2 begin with to tell the story of the repairs that were made, and you see the little triangle there on all these. It'll kind of move around to show where we are. So we're looking in kind of a little bit from the northwest back at the city, and it begins with the sheep gate. So if you notice in this the big enlarged part of this wall, what's it enclosing there? It would be at the northern part of the city. That's the Temple Mount. That's the temple that you can see. So what do you think the purpose of the sheep gate would be for something so near the temple? Okay, a lot of sheep came through that gate and didn't go back out, did they? That was a reason that the sheep gate was so close to the temple. It's because it's where all the sacrificial lambs and so forth were brought into there. We know from the New Testament, John 5 verse 2, that the pool of Bethesda that was mentioned in Jesus' work there was right next to the sheep gate. So most people believe that the pool was used to wash the sheep in preparation for the sacrifice that would then take place in the temple in that area very next to it. But the first builders, or Eliashib, the high priest, and the other priests with him, I think it's intentional in my mind that Nehemiah starts with the high priest and those people. That just mentions that Eliashib, the high priest, arose with his brothers, the priests, and built the sheep gate. That's the way chapter 3 begins. I believe other people were rising up at the same time, but he's, I think, giving prominence to these leaders and showing that they were willing to work, and they were working right alongside many of the other people. As we get more into the details of chapter 4 about how they worked, there's obviously division of duties between people who we call burden bearers, who would carry loads of dirt and rock and things. There were the actual builders, and there were overseers or supervisors or leaders that were helping direct the work too. But it's very clear that these officials or leaders were deeply involved with it, except with one exception we'll get to in a minute, where the leaders would not lower themselves to work on the wall. So Their extent of their work was quite extensive. It went from the sheep gate there on the left all the way through these two towers. They're called the Tower of the 100 or the Tower of Mia, I think in the Old King James Version, Tower of Hananel. So they covered all of that, but next to them then it mentions the men of Jericho worked, and then the men of Zachar under his direction were working. So that's the kind of the north part, and all these people were working side by side as they worked together on the city. Okay, so I'm not going to read all of these verses, but just we'll note some particular things of interest. But as we turn around and now looking from the west back at the northwest section of the wall, brings up the fish gate beginning in verse 3. And the sons of Hassaniah were the ones that built the fish gate. And almost every case when they talk about the gates, it uses terms like they laid its beams, hung its doors with its bolts and bars. They're not just building the stones, but they're making them where the gates can be closed, and it's not just a big welcome arch that people can walk straight through. These gates are going to be fortified so that the walls are actually useful. I forgot to mention on this slide the Elisha and the priest, the little red asterisk. It's meant to remind me, make a point there, and I didn't. It mentions in the work that they did in verse 1, that they consecrated or dedicated their work. That's not going to be mentioned again throughout the rest of chapter 3 until you see the entire wall is dedicated in chapter 12. So there's something special about the high priest and the priestly people who are working there, that they actually, it's kind of the first fruits of the building, that they decided to do a dedication of their own work. So anyway, the sons of Hassaniah, then next to them is Meremoth, Meshullam, and Zadok, all working. And then verse 5, it's interesting, the Tekoites. What was unusual about what's mentioned in chapter 5, verse 5, about the Tekoites? Anybody? That was, I think, question 2 in our book. Well, what's worthy of note, Joe? Okay. Their lead, I think it's the maybe NIV or ESV. I didn't make in my notes. It says their nobles would not stoop to serve their Lord. So basically, they wouldn't lower themselves. And in a lot of these verses, the Hebrew is a little bit difficult, and you'll notice differences in translation. Some of them say they would not put their shoulder to the work to work under their supervisors. So the Lord obviously could mean Lord or supervisor or leader or the Lord or whatever. So there's some differences in translation, but basically they wouldn't put their shoulder to the work. They wouldn't stoop to work, whether it was because they wouldn't work under the direction of these building supervisors, or they wouldn't work for the Lord, either way. But this is worth noting, that the Tekoites didn't slow them down. In fact, we'll see later on and get to the other side, they built another section of the wall, despite the fact that their leaders or nobles would not stoop to the work. It's worth noting, though, this is the only time in this whole section, chapter 3, that we see leaders who failed to work. And I'll try to note that as we go through, where in addition to the high priest that I already mentioned, there's many times people who are mentioned as officials or leaders or the governors or some sort of a title attached to the individuals that were leading the work. So this is by far and away the exception of where both leaders and common people were working side by side in the work here. So as we kind of continue on down to the south, here on the west wall, the old gate is repaired. Jehoiada, I think in the old King James, and Meshullam, and these people are not, of course, there's two men working by themselves. And most every case is talking about the leaders of the groups that they worked and that worked under them, but they're the ones that are organizing this work. And of course, Nehemiah is the leader over all of this work and has done a lot of organizational work. We don't know what all went through Nehemiah's mind when you think back to chapter 2 when he went out on that night ride to inspect, to see the condition of the walls. But between that time and when they rise to work, he had to have been formulating a lot of plans. So we see from the way he responded to the king of Persia with all his plans, Nehemiah was a man who planned well, and he put his plans to action. And so as we see these sections, the way our author divided them up on page 26, I counted 44 sections, and depending on how you count the people responsible, about 41 groups divided that up, so about 3 groups did double duty. But all this organization and work was important to note that they're doing their part. God has put them in this time and place for this effort. God's going to guard them and help them and going to be on their side, but requires us to do our part too. And that was evident from all the work that went into this. So Melatiah and Jaden are worth noting because it mentions in their section of verse 7 that translations vary. Either they were repairing the seat of the governor of Trans-Euphrates, who had an office on the wall or something like that, or else what they represented in verse 7 were the men of Gibeon and Mizpah, which some translations say those 2 cities were under the control of the governor of Trans-Euphrates. So again, the Hebrew is a little bit difficult there, but I've shown it as an office up on the penthouse of the tower where the governor's area was repaired. But that is of some question. It's exactly what they repaired. Now we start seeing some trades mentioned. There's family names given early. There's the class of the priest and the family of the high priest. Now we'll see some regular trades like the goldsmiths, the perfumers, and it says Hananiah and the perfumers repaired up to the broad wall. Most people believe the broad wall was part of ruins that were torn down that went off to the west even further that were not repaired, as Nehemiah just enclosed a much smaller part. This would be part of that big rectangle that I showed on the other thing. They repaired to the broad wall, but the broad wall was not repaired, best we can understand. So then beyond the broad wall, between that and this tower of the ovens or tower of the furnaces, it mentions Rephaiah. And I've used this little, I don't know if that's a sergeant stripe or what, but just to show that he was the official of the half district of Jerusalem, and he was leading these repairs, again, as a leader who was willing to stoop to the work and to lead them. And then Jediah, Hattush, and Melchiah, I guess, and Hashub all worked together. And then on the other side, Shallum, who's also an official over the another half district, and a little red asterisk on Shallum from verse 12. So what is unusual about the repairs that Shallum did? So I noted that in your reading. What stands out to you about? Okay, his daughters work, and so it wasn't a men-only thing. You would think that would be mainly the ones bearing the burdens and so forth, but mentions in this case that Shallum was using his daughters in the work that was going on. And he was also an official over half of the district of Jerusalem. And so see a leader who's willing to put his daughters to work. So now if we move on down to the lower section of the western wall, it's worth noting that there's just one group, Hanan and the Zenoites, and they are repairing quite a long section of the wall, 1,000 cubits in length. So this would be 1,500 feet or 500 yards of wall, quite a bit, extended from the valley gate all the way down to the dung or refuse gate that would be on the very southern tip of Jerusalem. past this pool of Siloam, or some say pool of Siloam, but I believe that's probably not correct. The pool of Siloam was probably inside the city, but this was been probably in that same vicinity. But our author mentions in one of the footnotes, footnote number 4 on page 26, probably as much as this would have been like 1/4 of the whole wall circumference that this one group repaired. That we could probably safely infer from that it was in pretty good shape to start with. For them to have done so much work at 1/4 basically of the whole wall themselves, it probably means they were just things like the Valley Gate or things that specifically mentioned they were having to repair. And that would make sense if you go back to what had happened to the city. It had been invaded by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar and burned with fire, but they would have torn down to make it unusable in places in order to break through because of the siege they had on the city and to invade them, because multiple years they were besieging the city. But apparently there's some parts that were left intact more than others. And this, because the topography and so forth, seems to be one that was not say easy to repair, but they were able to make much more under their own work to get all this done there. So then we kind of began to turn the corner in verses 14 and 15. Again, we can see that pool and the little section also kind of outside called the King's Garden. And the Dung Gate is there on the southern tip, and you turn the corner to the Fountain Gate. And mentions, again, an official, Malchijah, and Shallum. And this is a different Shallum, but he's also an official that's working. And he repaired not only the Fountain Gate, but these walls around the pool and the King's Garden. So a lot that he did. Turn around, there's going up the eastern wall now, there's 5 sections that go from the Fountain Gate all the way up to what Boundary Translation is called the angle or the buttress or the turning of the wall. And we'll see in a minute that's kind of an indentation of the wall as they go further up the eastern side. And it's really just where the wall kind of bends inward. And you can see there's depicted in this picture all this rubble down below towards the Kidron Brook and the Kidron Valley. And we'll see now the people listed. This is not probably the Nehemiah that our book is named after, but Nehemiah was an official that also built along that section. Rehum, Hashabiah, Baviah, and Ezra, all of these were listed as officials, rulers who worked with their people in order to do this rebuilding. So just to kind of come back to that point, what's most the commentators and even the archaeological evidence backs up is appears like what Nehemiah is doing on this eastern wall, where the wall kind of bends inward, is they're bypassing the old terraced eastern wall. And there's accounts earlier in the Jews' history of the Gihon Spring and things being enclosed, which would have been very close down to the Kidron Brook. And you see somewhat maybe in those pictures a kind of a terraced effect. There would have been a lot of that wall that went very close to the source of water under Solomon's time, or Hezekiah, I think, is particularly mentioned as one who brought water supply into the city. Most commentators think what Nehemiah did for a couple of reasons. It said, okay, there's so much rubble down in the valley where this, because of the steep and how it's kind of up on a crest of a hill, apparently the Babylonians had just torn down this rubble and it had fallen down into the valley. It was becoming so much of an obstacle that rather than trying to repair that part, they just built up above on the crest of the hill, up above the rubble. And it made it quicker, and also was less to defend, and it gave them the high ground rather than trying to defend down in the valley as well. And so probably for multiple reasons. And also there's archaeological evidence that we may not have time to get into, but I got a slide or two that shows that they've discovered a wall higher up on the crest of the hill that has been identified as Nehemiah's wall. and there's a lot of other rubble that's still discoverable that dates back more to Nebuchadnezzar's time. So that's what's going on now, and that's just, I think I showed this last week, a depiction of how Nehemiah couldn't ride on his horse past all the rubble that had been cast down into the valley. So now we're up towards the midpoint, and above these terraces that you can see are depicted there. And the next section, verses 20 through 23, talk about Eliashib's house. Eliashib, of course, was the high priest who began the building on the north part. And Baruch is mentioned. And in most translations, there's some differences in the manuscripts, but most translations, Baruch is commended because he zealously repaired or vigorously repaired his section from the angle up to Eliashib's house. And so everyone was working and repairing, but for whatever reason, Nehemiah called him out as being especially dedicated in his work and zealously repairing. There's a footnote. It's missing in the ESV, but there's a footnote that is appear in many of the manuscripts. And then after Baruch, we start getting to, in this next several sections, a lot of the builders lived very close to that section of the wall. So you can imagine it was good motivation. If my house is just inside the city, that I want to have a good stout wall protecting my house and my family. And Meremoth, I've underlined him to emphasize this is a person who's mentioned before who had already done work, so he's doing double duty here. But it mentions he repaired the section that was opposite his house. And so that's going to be the kind of the pattern for the next several sections. The priests repaired parts after their house, Benjamin and Hashub, the same, and Azariah up to his house. And so it's proceeding on up along the eastern wall. To get beyond that, there's another section, another kind of angle that goes in that's used as a reference. And so this next section begins from Azariah, was the last builder at his house, up to that section. And Benui is listed as one of the builders there, as well as Palau. And so we're getting on up close to the water gate. Pedaiah is another builder there. And then the temple servants are mentioned, or the Nephiim, in some translations, or people that helped out in the building. So you're getting close up towards another part near the temple, and you start seeing the work of the temple servants. So here we are, very close now to the what would be the northeastern part of the wall, beginning at the water gate up to the horse gate. This part going up towards the Temple Mount was called Ophel, and it was where many of the temple servants and others lived. And now another people that did double duty. We visited the Tekoites before. Those were the people who had no real leaders willing to do the work, but didn't stop them from being diligent. I think wasn't that where Amos was from? I think Amos was, from Tekoa, and so where his home place would be. And they were diligent enough, even though their leaders were not, to build another section. And then up above the horse gate, it mentions more priests did repairs next to their houses. And then now this section begins at verse 29 and 30, goes up from the horse gate to the muster gate. And I think that's different translations. What do someone have besides the muster gate in verses 29 and 30, whatever. There's the east gate, and then the inspection gate. That's a verse 31 or whatever. So inspection or muster gate varies, but that's kind of delineate now this next section. I have Zadok, Shemaiah, Hananiah, and Haran, and Meshullam. Again, he's the third of ones I was able to identify who did double duty. He also built on the other side of the wall, but this was now near his house, and so he built there. So we see three different peoples or leaders who did an extra section. And this leads up now to the northeastern corner, and we kind of turn the corner and look back, and it just mentions Malchijah of the goldsmiths from this muster or inspection gate all the way to what's called the upper room of the corner, or the room over the corner. And he built these several sections of this wall, and you can see the temple, of course, right in view there above that. And then back to where we started. Nehemiah 3:32 gives the final section between this room of the corner, the upper room, and the sheep gate. The goldsmiths and the merchants carried out repairs. So if you think about it, they're the last ones mentioned. The first ones mentioned are really just to their right as we're looking at where Elisha and the high priest and the priests were working. So again, side by side, goldsmiths and merchants with the high priest and his people. So just amazed at the diversity of the people that worked on this. And I just inserted there the guard gate, because when they talk about the dedication of the wall, that's also mentioned, and it's apparently just past the sheep gate. So that's the 41 groups on 44 assignments. That's just a picture from our book on page 26. So you can see a lot of things done. Just a lot of hard work is the way I'd summarize it. You use the word built, multiple verses, repaired, started putting down every verse, and then finally stopped at the verse 10. Every verse through verse 32, from 10 to 32, uses the word repair. A lot of building and repairing going on. And I'll just say, I may not get to be able to show the slides. The archaeological evidence shows evidence on this Nehemiah wall of both freshly quarried rock, which would be probably what the building part is, and repairing, where they reuse rubble for a kind of a mixed construction materials on the walls. And that's consistent with the account that we see. A lot of teamwork. Use the word next to or after or between, and just showing kind of shoulder to shoulder, all these people working together and kind of fellowship to work for the Lord's cause here. And that's just, I can't say enough about the lesson that is for us. And at least 3 groups, people of Merimoth and Meshulam and the Kohites, did double duty. So let's get into Nehemiah 4 with the time we have left, because now that this is going on, it's listed, the enemies, again, are not very happy with what's going on, are they? And it's kind of like what we saw when Nehemiah rode up on his horses with his first presentation that, hey, I've got the king's backing on this. And it's interesting after their ridicule to see it's the reaction, I guess, of Nehemiah. Reminds me of some of the Psalms. We call them Psalms of deprecation, because he basically prays in verse 4 and 5 that return this reproach back on their own heads, and prays for God's justice. But we see the reaction of the people is the work just keeps on. The work's not slowed down. It says a commendable thing that the people had a mind to work. With any work that we have for the Lord, that's really the most important part. Is people having a mind to work. It's important to have good leaders and things like what Nehemiah had put in place, but you had to depend on people having a mind to work. And you can see kind of at least a little detail in that the gaps were closed first before they built the full height of the wall. And that seemed to be a pretty good strategy, rather than saying, I'm going to get it perfect and then move on. They had all of this concentrated work to close the gaps up to a half of the height it mentions. So again, the enemies are angered even more, and they decide we're going to have a different attack. These people have not been slowed down just because we've belittled their efforts and tried to ridicule them. That they seem like they're going to actually try to get the armies together and conspire to attack them. That's mentioned in verses 7 and 8. Not only Sanballat and Tobiah, but also the Arabs, the Ammonites and Ashdodites are all now kind of in conspiring together, see what they can do, and come, verse 8, and fight against Jerusalem and cause disturbance to it. So the intensity of the resistance seems to increase. Look at verse 9. But we prayed to our God, and because of them we set up a guard against them day and night. over and over again, you can see this kind of dual response by Nehemiah, both prayer for God's help, but getting busy with man's work. And that's a good model for us. That's a short quote I've got here in a minute, but it mentions just we can't just lay it at God's feet and then go about our leisure, and we can't expect to do it ourselves without God's help. It takes the two together, and that's prayer plus action. Now these internal issues seem to start cropping up in verses 10 through 12. It's this kind of, at least in my translation, a couplet, a verse that's given in verse 10. The strength of the burden bearers is failing, yet there's much rubbish, and we ourselves are unable to rebuild the wall. Seems a combination of maybe pessimism and exhaustion with all the rubble and things that were in the way. I like the way I think the Contemporary English Bible translates verse 10. It said, "Meanwhile, the people of Judah were singing a sorrowful song. So much rubble for us to haul, worn out and weary, we'll never finish this wall." And probably it rhymes in English. It probably wasn't exactly a perfect translation, but it's something about the language implies a couplet verse with the way verse 10 is working. So that people are moaning and groaning, even maybe making a song or verse out of it. But they also mention that they're concerned about the rumors that they're here that they're going to come and attack us, and there's multiple times that's mentioned to Nehemiah that they're going to get us, and they're sent requests for their men to come home and help defend them. Mentions that 10 times out of fear they were asked to stop, and so these people are. These enemies are preying on the fears of the Jews, and internally now there's this concern and fear. But what Nehemiah does is he posts defenders in prominent places so that the enemies can see that the city is well defended, and he actually organizes them. If you look at the way it's exposed, it's mentioned in last part of verse 13. I stationed the people in families with their swords, spears, and bows. And then in verse 14, I saw their fear, I arose and spoke to the nobles, officials, and the rest of the people. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome. So first he's saying God's fighting for us, basically. But then he goes on to say, fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. So he's basically organizing them both in such a way that they depend on God, but also that they are organized by clan, so they're fighting for their families. And he's having them work on parts of the wall that are next to their families, and gives them extra incentive. And it appears like the enemies just see, okay, they're ready for us. There's no chance of a surprise attack, and the work on the wall resumes. Verses 16 through 20 are interesting. We won't go through all that, but there seems to be dual roles, and people, burden bearers, were doing one thing with a weapon in one hand and trying to carry as much as they can with the other. The builders seem to be still working with both hands because they're right at the wall. And then there's even the trumpet alarm system set up with a trumpeter who would be near Nehemiah, and if they saw an attack, they would blow the trumpet in the area where they need to rally for the defense. And then again, our God will fight for us, he says in verse 20. So again, coming back to God's protection. And then just the end of that of this chapter talks about just the amount of intense dedication on the people. They worked not from dawn till sunset, from dawn till slap dark, as we used to say it, till the stars came out, it said. So they worked even beyond through the dusk till it was just too dark to continue working. And they're even asked by Nehemiah to not go to their homes if they were people like the Tekoites lived outside the city, but they stayed and slept there. And it appears like they never even removed their clothes. Again, the Hebrew's difficult here. Did they take them off to wash, or was something about when they went to get a drink of water? It's hard to say. It's very difficult. But just this one quote I wanted to say about his example of prayer in action. Nehemiah put himself and his cause under divine protection. It was the way of this good man and should be our way. All his cares, all his griefs, all his fears he spread before God. Before he used any means, he made his prayer to God. Having prayed, he set a watch against the enemy. We think to secure ourselves by prayer without watchfulness, we're slothful and tempt God. if by watchfulness, watchfulness only, without prayer, we're proud and slight God. Either way, we forfeit His protection. God's care of our safety should engage and encourage us to go on with vigor in our own duty. Quote from Matthew Henry. I think that's just good to show that combination is demonstrated over and over again. I won't have time to go over this, but this is basically this archaeologist's conclusion that he thinks this was all identified and accurately reflects the work of Nehemiah. So next week we'll get the second half of Lesson 5, and appreciate everyone's help. And we'll see you then. Thank you.